And now we've got Alan and Becky, who I gather are sort of doing a double act to make us think further. They've both got an incredible amount of experience in archaeology in Scotland. Alan as a heritage consultant working across the UK, also doing archaeological assessments, research particularly in the role of cultural heritage in landscape planning. And he's a very experienced lecturer and been involved in lots of other heritage committees and organisations, while Rebecca, who's presently head of archaeology strategy at Historic Scotland, was previously an archaeologist with the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments for Scotland. I'm not going to mention the fact that both of them seem to have some interest in Roman things. Maybe we're not going to go there. Yeah. So between them, a wealth of experience, which is not particularly overlapping. And they tell me that one of the main things they're going to do is be provocative to help us move forward our thoughts and discussions. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious the programme says, the other thing I was going to add is that no Romanists were harmed in the preparation of this lecture, and that's the only time you will hear me mention that word. The programme says, what will the archaeology of tomorrow look like? Well, Alan and I are not going to be so presumptive as to tell you. This is the participation session, so what we intend to do is set the scene. And actually, after Jackie's lecture earlier today, we actually both turned to each other and said, well, actually, we don't need to say anything now, because actually we can just move on from Jackie's talk, because I think it was so instructive, informative, and stimulating. So I'm actually going to start with a quote from Jackie from this afternoon, where she referred to it not being instruction, but provocation. And that's what Alan and I hope to do this afternoon. Now, the context in which I'm speaking is the background of trying to work towards Scotland's first ever strategy for archaeology. And we set up a strategic archaeology committee a couple of years ago, combining a range of experts with very different backgrounds across archaeology. And as you can imagine, you get 15 or so archaeologists in a room, and trying to get them to agree on the same thing is a challenge. So we've had quite stimulating and interesting debates and discussions at our various meetings over the last couple of years. The landscape in which we're operating, obviously you saw this in Baxter's lecture yesterday, the Historic Environment Strategy for Scotland, which came out last year, which is the overarching strategy for the historic environment. So we're looking at archaeology's place and the role of archaeology in relation to this. But I also wanted to also refer to the fact that archaeology isn't just about, it's about a range of things, but the wealth of collections in museums, which are ripe for study. They are being studied, and there's so much more research that can be done, that we wanted to try and say, well, actually, it's about museums as well. It's about a range of activities. What we've actually got out for consultation at the moment is a draft archaeology strategy. It is very much a draft. What we want to do is we thought we'd put out some ideas out there, some comments, some thoughts, and we want you to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and what's missing. I'm not necessarily expecting you all to have read it and answer that question this afternoon, but the consultation runs till the 9th of June, and there are copies and some questionnaires outside in the foyer, but it's all online, and I'm very happy to provide people with URLs and further information. And I think there's probably a link to it on the Society website, isn't there? Just to remind you what we're talking about, we've been very clear in our definition of archaeology that we're saying it is the study of the human past through its material remains. Now, in the strategy, we have come up with a draft vision. It's not really fully fleshed out. I don't think this is going to be the final vision. But actually, what we felt that our mantra was making archaeology matter. That's actually what we want to do. Now, Ian made reference in his talk yesterday to mainstreaming, and if you mainstream, then you're not a specialist anymore. But I would argue what we actually want to do is successfully mainstream the historic environment and successfully mainstream archaeology, but you still need specialisms, you still need specialists. So I like to think we can have both. In the strategy that we've got out for consultation, we've identified 7 strategic priorities. A lot of the language is similar to some of the other language you've heard in things this afternoon. It's about participation, engagement. It's about understanding, caring, celebrating. It's about the skill set and actually developing that skill set and recognizing the importance of knowledge. Innovation was particularly struck yesterday with the way that the panel yesterday afternoon presented really some quite complex science in a language that I think we could understand, which was, I'm very grateful to them for doing that. But it actually just starts to open up our minds to just some of the possibilities that are actually out there in some of the innovative techniques and applications. And then, of course, there's all the innovation around dissemination, social media, the phenomenon of the selfie, thinking about data, thinking about archives, thinking about museum collections. Open access was mentioned also today, and how that is pushing our discipline and where that's going to take us with regards to accessibility of information. And then finally, improving how we structure and manage archaeological projects. And I will now hand over to Alan.
Thanks, Becky. I'm just going to reiterate before I start that this is not about us outlining the future. This is about trying to get everybody to join in. The strategy is deliberately intended to provoke you to do that to some extent. We think this is probably one in a generation's opportunity to try to put something into it. And I'm certainly not going to tell you what the future is because I can't see the future. I can't even see my notes at the moment, so I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge. However, there's a few thoughts that we can kick off with. There's a few things that we can throw out there which may get people stirred up. And if we can't have a debate about it, then we really are stuck. This interesting image, some of you may have seen it. It occurred, I think it is Bordeaux. It's either Bordeaux or Toulouse, somewhere on the west coast of France, where a bunch of students decided to go out one night. There was a zoo there which is closed down. They decided they'd liberate a llama and take it along with them for a night out and then put it back at the end of it, which looks like quite a happy photograph to me. It's meant to represent culture and nature. And the interaction of culture and nature, which is essentially one of the things that we need to take on board, I think, as we go forward into the future. Not that we haven't done it, but the reason I come to this and the reason that I want to bring up to begin with this concept, which is commonly referred to as landscape, is because one of the most telling quotes I've seen in the last few years came from a local minister in a fairly disadvantaged area of Glasgow called Milton. And in the context of a series of things called the Glasshouse debates, he came out with what is an absolutely killer line, which is crap places kill people. And I think what we deal with goes to the very nub of that, because we deal with people and we deal with people in places. And we deal with people in places where there is an interaction of culture and nature. And that concept is enshrined in the word landscape, although we have a long way to go before we have a common understanding of what that really means. So one of the things that I think we could use as a kind of a framework or something that encapsulates it in a relatively simple way is this sense that what we're dealing with is how people interact with their environment and how that environment acts on them, and what we can do as archaeologists to try to take that forward into the future in better ways. Use the knowledge that we have to drive that forward. The word appears, in fact, the concept appears as a key theme in the historic environment strategy for Scotland. So we're not off-piste as far as that's concerned either. But I think we have quite a long way to go with that. And there are various things that we need to do to try to take it forward. But it gives us a framework. There are some other things that I have certainly come across over the years which I think we need to be a little bit more introspective about. One of them is where we all come from as archaeologists. The vast majority of people working in archaeology come from an academic background. And a great deal of the trappings of the subject and the way that it's expressed, the way that it's unfolded more broadly, seems to me to have a strongly academic feel to it. Now, this is not to belittle academia, and certainly not to belittle people working in academia, because there's a very important role there. The place of the expert in society, I think, is still extremely important. It's a very prestigious place. It's a very prestigious role in the eyes of most members of the public, and we should be very mindful of that. But if we continue to only talk to ourselves and use devices which are, whether we recognize it or not, exclusionary, then we are going to struggle to get the support of the wider public that we need. That's not the same as dumbing the subject down. And some of the things that we saw in Jackie's presentation, I think, show you the sorts of things that we can do. We still need people working, if you like, at a deep level in archaeology, doing cutting-edge research, getting right to the heart of things, in ways which are not necessarily easily transferable. But we also need people who are working at a more surface level, and we need more of them. And it seems to me that there's a whole body of people out there willing to do that who don't need to come from an academic background. They can be our advocates if we take the time to engage them. And to engage them, we need to get active. We can't sit there and wait for people to come to us. I know from having worked in a variety of different contexts just how intimidating some people find the concept of coming to a university, in any context whatsoever, whether as adult students, whether as undergraduates, or whether just as visitors. And similarly, in a wonderful building like this, there's an awful lot of people out there who would simply not feel comfortable in here. They wouldn't know where to begin. We have this wonderful series of lectures. We have an amazing array of speakers who have been really so incredibly entertaining and inspiring. But actually, there's something about the very building, about the institution, about the nature, the context in which it all sits, which means that despite these lectures being free, despite there being a fairly open door policy to come in and out as you wish, we're largely speaking to ourselves. And that strikes me as a serious problem if we want to move the subject forward into the future. I have no worries whatsoever about the quality of the people who will be taking on that mantle, because I've seen people coming through university over a long period of time, and I've also seen people out there who have still to get to university, whether it be as kids at school coming through or whether it be as adults who are thinking about coming in and taking courses in the subject. There's a wonderful array of talent out there. We simply need to harness it in the right ways. And that means we need to get pretty focused on doing that. The statistic I had in my head was that there are roughly 500 professional archaeologists in Scotland, and there's roughly 5 million people in Scotland. That's a ratio of 1 to 10,000. That's pretty killing. And when Ian's lecture came up with other statistics, when I think we were looking at less than 5,000 professional archaeologists in the United Kingdom at the last count, with, 60 to 65 million people in the country, it looks even more challenging. Which tells me that the only way we're going to do this is by working smart and by working together. And that means we've got to break down some other barriers, some other labels, some other things that I don't think are particularly helpful. And coming from a background in commercial archaeology takes me to one of those. Let's start with that. I'd like to see that phrase binned forever. I think it is unhelpful. I think it is inaccurate. And I think there's an element in it which is actually quite insulting to the people working in the area. People who work in what is termed commercial archaeology are archaeologists, the same as everybody else. They do all sorts of different types of work, just as people working in the government organisations are, people working in museums are, and people working in universities are. Why are we badging them in that way and clumping them all together under this one label when they represent such a wide range of different approaches? If we can get rid of that and simply refer to each other as archaeological organisations, it might actually start to help us work together instead of thinking of ourselves always being in competition with each other. We can't afford to be in competition with each other in that way. It doesn't mean we can't do work on a commercial basis. We can, but let's not refer to ourselves in that very, very narrow way as we go into the future. Let's get some new models for how we do that. And let's transform our practice as well. We are sometimes a little precious about archaeology. And many people have come to this issue and have discussed this subject in the past. So it's not that this is something new, but I make no apology for bringing it up again. As we move into the future, there is something to be said for looking to a new breed of person who is not just an archaeologist, or not just an historian, or not just an ecologist, or not just a landscape architect, or whatever else it might be, but people who can actually fuse those disciplines together and come up with something more interesting and perhaps more fit for purpose in the 21st century. Some of the talks that we heard over the course of this weekend have alluded to that, have actually shown us that in action. That amazing panel that we had yesterday was incredibly inspiring, and there's an example of some of that fusion taking place. There are all sorts of other ways we can do that. So let's not stick in our silos in that way. Let's come out of them and actually start to build something better, which starts with working together. Becky, you have something just before we close and open this up. Where's the down switch? Yeah, just run through them. This point, yeah.
Okay. I was at a grandly monikered European Archaeological Council meeting in March, which was effectively government archaeologists from across Europe. And somebody took the abstracts and put them into this word cloud. And this word cloud, the thing that really jumps out is how many times state and legal and monuments and protection comes through. And yet the whole purpose of the discussion was actually to talk about the Valletta Convention, which is the early 90s one that was actually all about protection, but how it meets Faro, which has been mentioned today, which is actually the cultural value and the people owning their own heritage. And actually a lot of the discussion focused on the stakeholders being the developers. And I and others were trying to move it on to the stakeholders being people, being the people who live in the countries in which we're working. And one of the things that we've been talking about is actually in terms of mainstreaming, in terms of getting everybody to get archaeology, to want to be interested in the historic environment, to understand what we're talking about, that a lot of that starts with education and learning. And so I wanted to draw your attention to a very recent resource that's been produced by the Forestry Commission in partnership with a range of partners. I'm not going to name them all because I'm bound to forget somebody. And I mean, Lego, fantastic. I mean, the idea of the ways in which that we can engage people. And this is a really valuable resource, which I'm certainly taking into my daughter's school next week. In the preparation of this discussion, I had a chat with a few archaeologists just to pick brains and say, well, what's your view on future archaeology? What are your thoughts? And so I thought I would produce an alternative word cloud, which doesn't mention state and regulation, and it's about people. Yes, the expert's still there, because we still need that, but actually it's about me. It's about personal interaction. Social media is revolutionizing the way people interact with each other and the way that they're interacting with their surroundings. And I mentioned earlier the cult of the selfie. This is me in Stonehenge. It's not a photo of Stonehenge anymore. This is a photograph of me in Stonehenge. That is the world that we are moving to. But what we want to do is make sure that what they're actually doing is based on knowledge and is based on accurate knowledge. And I think, again, Jackie exemplified that brilliantly earlier. Obviously, that knowledge can only take you so far, but it's actually, it's your heritage, it's my heritage, it's everybody's heritage. And it needs to have that multivocal strand.
I'll go further than that. I'll say, I think we need to be a damn sight less precious than we have been in the past about this. What's wrong with people taking up ideas that we've put out there and taking them in different directions if it empowers them and if it takes them forward? So we have to correct it. So we have to get into a debate. We're all taught in a particular way as archaeologists. We're taught about the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, despite the fact that we know damn well that those things don't exist. They're constructs. So what's wrong with that happening in a broader context? Let's get people engaged first, and then we can worry about what they're doing with the information. And actually, that means we'll get brought into the public domain all the more often to explain that. I see no problem with that. What I do see a problem with is the fact that increasingly, and it's not just a problem that affects archaeology, we have no time to think. And we need time to think. We need to create space for each other to have those ideas continuing to come through. We have a few people in the room that I'm surprised to say, given the advanced age I'm getting to now, I can still see as people that I looked up to when I was younger. One of them is going to follow us onto the stage. I want to see more people like that coming through. And to do that, we need to be able to give them time to show what they can do and to create some of the wonderful things that we've heard some of our speakers talking about over this weekend. Because that, I think, is at the core of it. So if we can use what we know and transfer that on and find clever ways to do it, then I think we have a way forward. And I hope that there's enough going on in the subject that we can start to actually push that into our archaeology strategy. So that instead of being the random ramblings of a collection of 15 people who happen to get together in a room a few times, it is actually something which represents somewhere what we as a group of people want to see happening in the future. Not be constrained by what we think we're going to be able to achieve. What do we want to see happen? Let's put that up there, and then let's try and make it happen. Now, I think it's time to open it up.
Right, well, I know you want to be provocative, but I'm in complete agreement with you, and particularly your last points, Alan. And I think I would just sort of throw out one word and a phrase. And the first word is co-production, in terms of working with people to find out what it is they're actually interested in. And actually, when I've personally done that, I've learned a lot more from their questions, because oftentimes their questions are a hell of a lot better than mine, and they're ones I hadn't thought of. But balancing that out is the phrase, and that's where being the expert comes in. And that is empirical honesty, and being honest to the people in the past whose lives we're trying to represent in the present. So it is a very tricky balance between co-production, working with people today, accepting alternative perspectives, but also keeping that responsibility to the folks that we've spent a lot of time learning about how to learn about them.
Thank you. I think that was very wise.
I found myself agreeing with a lot of what you were saying, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts about actually the process of taking that forward. And the archaeology strategy seems to be one way, but I was just wondering, what's the next step? And maybe that's a question to the audience as well as just to both of you.
Well, there isn't a single answer to it, Jeff, as I think you know. And it's to do with people taking responsibility to some degree for their own actions and deciding to follow their own consciences. But I think it's also about trying to get together, to talk with each other. I think there's what Audrey's just said about co-production, what I'd said earlier about working together. This actually works on a very simplistic level. It's not some high concept. It's about the fact that if I'm sitting in a room on my own, I'm going to be constrained by my own thoughts. And because I'm getting old, I get distracted and I'll start looking at something else and I'll stop focusing on what I'm supposed to be focusing on. If I'm sitting in a room with somebody else and I'm spitting out ideas and they're coming back at me, I'll actually be able to produce something. If I'm sitting in a room with 2 or 3 people, that can become even more intense. It's incredibly empowering. But what we do is we tend to just stick because we have no time to think about it and we don't take the opportunity, we don't make the opportunity to do that more often. It never happens, or it doesn't happen nearly as much as it should. It might happen in the context of, oh, we've got to get this project together, or we're going to put this bid together, let's sit down and think about it. That's fine, those are constructs. We should be doing that all the time, and we should be mixing it up more so that we are meeting different people with different mindsets and then becoming more empowered ourselves as well as giving that out. It's a far better way to work.
I'll also chip in and give you the party line, which obviously is, with the strategy out for consultation, one of the questions we've got is, how would you like to be involved? And so I would encourage you to answer that question. And there's various ways in which we've said, well, we need to actually look more in depth at this issue, and we want to assess that issue. And actually, that's going to require people to actually sit and discuss these things. And precisely what Alan was saying is talking to each other and saying, right, what are the issues here and what are the solutions? And where do we want to go? Where do we want to be?
You're talking with your culture and environment there. You're talking about placemaking and communities. And you mentioned Milton and Glasgow and other ones. There's an element of serendipity where archaeology is, and it turns up in communities. And are we trying to expect too much of archaeology to always be involved with these communities? We can do things with a curriculum for excellence with schools and things, toolkits on the pits and things, but sometimes it's trying to get this, it's more than archaeology that we need to get in there, isn't it? And how we build in with other groups there.
Again, I agree with you entirely, Jonathan. But I think there's, I'm hearing in there that sense of, oh, it's too big a problem to tackle. But it's not. You tackle it one step at a time. And one of the first steps is exactly what you've said. You work with other people. So if you do have something else that needs to be done in a community, then you sit down with that person and you talk to them, or you sit down with a group of people and you talk to them. And if that community's problem is to do with the built environment, then you get people who are interested in that, some people who have expertise in it, some people who are directly affected by it, some people who can bring about change, and you try to get them to sit down around a table. And often they won't, because there'll be somebody who is crucial to that who doesn't want to sit down around the table, and there'll be reasons why they don't want to do that. And this process isn't something that you can just switch on, switch off. There are certain contexts where I've been working for 20 years to try to get something to happen, and I'm still trying to get it to happen. And I may never get it to happen, but it's not going to stop me trying. What I'm saying is I think we all need to be a little bit more determined about that. I don't think we've got much choice. And is archaeology the solution in all the problems? No, it's not, but it's central to it, and it should be. And if we really want this subject to be taken seriously in the future, to have the funding resources directed towards it, to play at a political level more commonly and more strongly, then we need people talking about it and saying, this is important to me. This actually makes a difference. And having seen that happen in a number of contexts, and there are other people in the audience who have seen it too, Audrey will have seen it, I'm sure, Jackie will have seen it, working in these communities, when you see that spark take off, you cease to control it. But it's almost like watching your child grow up and walk off. It's incredible to see it. And when you get that, that's addictive. And that's what I want all archaeologists to see. And at the moment, I don't think they're getting it. It's not because they can't do it.
I think I'd like to come back on on Alan's dismissal of the 3-age system. This has been fashionable for rather a long time. The first point I'd make is I'd be a bit happier about that if I was confident that enough of our 5,000 professional archaeologists actually knew the difference between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, whatever you like to call it, because too many of them don't. But a more specific example in the context that we're talking about is what is one of the currently most active fields where archaeology is engaging with people who are not archaeologists, and this is metal detectorists through, and I'm thinking more about the Portable Antiquities scheme in England, the rather smaller scale in which things happen in Scotland, but this is a big deal. Lots of people go out on sunny weekends like this, find lots of stuff and come in and show it to somebody and expect to be told what it is. In many cases, the number of archaeologists who can do that is pretty small because that has always been unfashionable. That's been unfashionable for many years. Museums are gearing down instead of gearing up. And if we're not careful, we could lose that kind of, we could lose that kind of knowledge. So I'm afraid you cannot so blithely dismiss these boring old aspects of archaeology because they are still important.
Can I ask if anybody else got the sense that I dismissed the 3H system? Because I don't think that was the point I was making. McCullough, get out. just leave.
I'm not sure this strategy stuff is what we really want.
Go on. Come on.
What do we want, Mr. Could you use the microphone, please?
He's being mischievous, so don't worry about it. If you have a serious point to make, Rod, then do you want the mic? I wondered if, in response to the metal detecting question, the comment on that, I'm going to look at David now, would you like to say anything? And because obviously you do have a lot of interactions and dealings with the metal detecting community. And actually, with regards to that, no, we don't have a portable antiquities scheme in Scotland. If you think we should have one, say so. But we do rely massively on the goodwill and the expertise of archaeologists based locally across Scotland, whether they're in the local authorities, whether they're in museums, whatever their capacity is as archaeologists, to do fantastic work with quite often metal detecting and other communities of interested participants. So, David, do you want to say anything specifically?
That's fabulously cruel of you.
I did say this was participatory.
As this is going online, I'll be very careful with what I say as well. Speaking as an archaeologist who has been heavily involved with metal detectors, in fact, doing a fabulous live, what was it called? Oliver's Army, Neil Oliver and myself, 435 detectorists near a scheduled monument. I'm now looking for signs of shock, horror, that metal detectors should be allowed so near. It was perfectly legal, but everything was done to attempt to stop them from doing it, something that is perfectly legal. And the amount of information that was gained from actually working with them was remarkable, which could have been lost if we hadn't done it. But why is it that we have such a problem? It comes to a point I was actually going to make. Why do we have such a problem with engaging with the public? We want the public to come into our world rather than us actually going into their world. We create this sort of fabulous ivory tower that we lock ourselves into and demand that they engage with us. It's like they have to come here to be able to engage. But they don't now, because we can actually have a YouTube video, hopefully, where we're going out into their world. The same with detecting. We don't like detectors because they are not the experts. We're the experts. I feel I'm rambling a bit because, as I say, it's a very big and difficult subject to deal with. The last count was something like 30,000 metal detectors going out every weekend.
Is that across the UK?
Across the UK. Approximately 30,000. Possibly 10,000, as low as 10,000, up to 30,000 detectors going out, finding objects which we can't actually gain information from. But we, in general, won't do it because we are, and this is the big word I was going to use, we are frightened. We're frightened of the public, and we're frightened with engaging with them. So I'll leave you with that one.
I realised that I didn't mention treasure trove in all the people that I should have talked about with in relation to metal detecting. Obviously, they are building lots and lots of relationships with the metal detecting community. And actually, one thing I will add, obviously there's a short piece in the Current Society newsletter about the Viking Hoard that was discovered in Galloway last September. And that was, we all did a kind of rapid emergency response, but the metal detectorist, when he realised he'd got something significant, he immediately stopped digging and rang the treasure trove in Edinburgh, and the local authority archaeologists went out and excavated it before the sun went down, basically, to try and get it out of the ground. And obviously there's been a huge amount of work done since then. And that has the potential to revolutionise aspects of Viking studies in southwest Scotland. And it's a chance find, but it's stunning, absolutely stunning, and there will be more news about that in the coming months.
Bob Mowat, Ageing Commission hack, former. I've done my bit for dealing with the general public, honest. Spent 25 years doing it, actually. 3 points, if I may. First of all, one essentially geographical point. Scotland is a large country. It is bigger than the other place. It is also has archaeology all over it. My native patch of northwest England was very briefly visited by some funny people called Romans who took one look at it and went away again without even bothering to introduce civil settlements. There then came along some funny people called Anglo-Saxons and the odd Vikings who distributed place names in huge numbers, but with absolutely no material evidence whatsoever. There then came another load of people who built medieval churches while apparently living in trees. And then suddenly, the area was sort of developed for a precocious industrial revolution. So the net result of that is that if you're interested in prehistory and you drive down from Carlisle to the south coast, you will see a stone circle on Shap, you will see a barrow on the A34 by Newbury, and you will see precisely nothing between. Whereas everywhere in Scotland has a reasonable distribution. It is a very varied country, and basically we are very lucky in the natural resource. So there is nobody who will not find an interest locally. The second point is to take up Brendan's point. I spent many a long year pretending to be a naval officer. It fooled nobody, but it took 20 years before they put me out. The Naval Reserve, in the days of its operation, depended on permanent staff who tidied up things during the week, who provided basic training and provided continuity. That reinforces, I think, the point that Brendan is making. You cannot run an organisation like this on the basis of amateurs alone. You have to have a knowledgeable, professional backup to provide continuity and, in particular, to deal with the results. And the same applies with excavations. As numerous people have pointed out, we're very good at starting excavations and possibly not as good at finishing them. Historic Scotland and the Society of Antiquaries, and to some extent the Commission, have had a very good track record of publishing excavations. Big excavations on classic sites, which must be the background to any development in the future. And also there is the need for a primary database. I challenge anybody, I will point out the deficiencies of Canmore quite happily. They are there. But I have, in looking around since I retired, I have yet to find any country in the world that has anything as good. So we actually start from a lot higher basis than we start off with. Anyway, enough wittering. One feasible suggestion, which will cost very little money. Becky's daughter, she's got her Lego of her pigs. She'll grow out that sooner or later. Could she start a move for gender equality, please? Because the time-honoured route into maritime archaeology is by building airfix models of the Mary Rose, the Vasa and the Batavia.
I'm delighted to hear you've mentioned gender equality. I gather, I'm afraid I missed Friday evening because I was driving said small child to stay with relatives so that I could be here. But I believe that David did raise it in his talk initially because I think we have a gender-balanced Rhind in terms of the speakers in this. I'm also conscious that the recent Chartered Institute for Archaeologists conference had a session that was all about equality. I wasn't at it. I don't know, were you in that session? No, I don't know if there's anyone who was in that session, but I gather it, Cara, I gather it was electrifying for everybody who was in there and very, very positive. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think in some respects it was very shocking, some of the stories that were coming out. But what has gathered since that session is quite a lot of online communication on Twitter, so using an established digital platform to discuss these themes further. And I think the idea is, I mean, linking into, I think, the wider dialogue, such as campaigns like Everyday Sexism and things like that, linking into some of the themes presented within that campaign and looking how they are manifesting themselves within archaeology and heritage. So I think actually we could be towards an exciting time where we do start to look at perhaps gender equality in archaeology, because it is still present in some areas, I think, in that we work in.
Thank you. I'd also like to add that actually equality isn't just about gender.
Yeah.
there's a broad range of equality issues that we could and should address, because looking round at the people in the room, we haven't got a massive diversity in our sector, and how do we improve that? And that's a question for all of us. How do we get that engagement? How do we broaden the people who are interested in our past?
I mean, allied to that issue, I think one of the challenges that we face is that we kind of engage with archaeology at two extremes. We either engage with archaeology at the point of we're watching something and go, wow, on the TV, or we've engaged with something that speaks to us on an emotional level, or it's the thrill of the discovery, you know, as we listened to yesterday afternoon. And at the other end, in communities, often when we come up against archaeology or something we understand as archaeology, it's when there's a threat perceived, where something's about to be knocked down, something's about to be dug up, something's about to disappear. And there's that huge middle ground of just places in which we live. And that's why I was very struck with what you were saying, Alan, about landscape. It's even broader than landscape, it's just place. And how we engage with place. And the fact is, we're getting to the point where, everything we've thrown away from yesterday could be and can be and will be archaeology. And all of that is about our everyday lives in everyday places. And spreading that message in that middle ground where it's not one extreme or another is where our real challenge lies.
This is Rob McCulloch. In essence, I agree with what you're saying, and I agree also with the need to spread the word, because I think that what we do is actually empowering, and the more people who are empowered, the larger the debates and the more exciting the subject becomes. But I wonder whether in our attempt to speak, in effect, out with our box, we've adopted the language which, by the time we come to use it, is already devalued. So that if you look at the historic environment strategy for Scotland, or indeed the draft strategy, we're using many of the words which have been borderized by management speak. They've been borderized by management into a management speak. I can't offer better words, but I think there is a danger that they almost instantly are worn out, and we are running behind the herd which is wearing out the language. And so I think part of the way of speaking, because that's what we're talking about, is to find some powerful language which is ours. Not the language of theory, which is as welcome as a hole in the head. It's not the language of complexity. You can see how the trade union movement, for instance, lost its supporters by talking about composites. But I think we are struggling with a communication problem. I can't help thinking that so much of the stuff we play with is visual. And it is in that visual expression of the excitement and of the mystery of the stuff from the past. I can't help thinking that one of the big skill sets that we perhaps don't employ sufficient of is the visual skill set. So at the recent conference in Cardiff, I attended the graphic archaeologists session, which was, to be honest, a grumble that there aren't enough pencil sharpeners. They've missed the point. That the language which they play in is instantly recognizable. It's very, how the language is heard or read and seen is personalized, and often, therefore, the message that we think we're giving becomes another message in the eyes of the beholder. But as Alan says, I think there is no problem with that. It's part of the engagement. So it's not really a question. It's a worry that the language... In fact, the word strategy... I mean, I always see strategy as, again, slightly devalued, because I think it's what that guy had when he was trying to get to Stalingrad, and it didn't do him much good. And I worry that in trying to make ourselves relevant to government, as we have to, we lose the capacity to speak to that much more interesting audience, which is the voters who put government in place.
Right, I was just going to come back to this again, because I've been having some rather interesting Facebook discussions as we speak as well. And it always comes down to the future of archaeology and future archaeology. It always comes down to blinking laser trowels, hover wheelbarrows, and a complete misunderstanding of what
Can you do that?
is. They will be coming from past horizons available for you.
Fantastic.
I did it. You can't unfortunately see this, but 20, those of us that can remember 20 years ago, yes. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have GPS-enabled smartphones. We didn't have 5 or 12 megapixel cameras on it. We didn't even have digital cameras, I think, 25 years ago. But I can show you on this one of my sites in 3 dimensions. This engendered great fear amongst archaeologists. You are taking away from us our skills. You are giving to others who have the technology, that which was done with pencil sharpener, pencil, and permatrace, and our own secret knowledge. But I was saying to them, you don't actually have anything to fear because we're not the gatekeepers. We shouldn't be the gatekeepers of knowledge. And if you're looking at, like, to understand the future of archaeology, you're quite right. We have to look at it where we are now. We cannot work out where we will be 25 years from now. I didn't believe this thing would exist 25 years ago. But the words are above your head, and it is, knowledge is empowering. And we have to work out a way to actually empower everybody else to share the knowledge that we gain. Not to act as gatekeepers, but to act as, I think it's like this idea, expert guides for people. And how do we get it out there to as many people as possible? And I learned something at FIFA, which was a brilliant new one. It's called Generation Z. These sub-19-year-olds who understand the world in a very, very different way than we do. And we're creating the world for them. We shouldn't be doing that because we're doing it, I'm afraid, in a fuddy-duddy, monographed way, where 30 years from now, they might be allowed to look at the information in a book which costs £150, when right now they can be looking at it on Twitter and Facebook and via other social media. And it's no surprise that, in fact, next to me I've got Maggie, who runs the Past Horizons Archaeology News website. 185,000 people go to that page because they are wanting to get the news right away. They want to understand what's going on. You can have that debate. I have on the Badger website the fabulous Badger Hive Mind, where you can ask a question on Badger. Within an hour, you'll have an answer from experts from across the world. That's how we should be creating our new futures, looking at it right now, and how we can enable the next generation to move ahead. Not in our image, but in theirs.
I just want to say something about the 180,000 people. When we first started doing this Facebook thing, it was really just to sell archaeological equipment. And so we just put up news stories, but we didn't really actually engage that much with people. And then one day I just sort of thought, actually, I'll try engaging with people when they make comments. You know, maybe we should actually answer them, you know. And that's what we started doing. And it just, you know, it just exploded after that. People from all over the world. And they constantly say, you know, this is a great page, you know, we learn so much. And these are people who are sitting at home, maybe, you know, they're in wheelchairs, they can't get out, you know, there's all sorts of people I've come to realise. And they just love it, you know, but we basically have Facebook on all day, every day. You know, that's what we have to do to actually, you know, engage with these people. And it's just us, you know, there's nobody else doing it. And then you see all these other organisations with so many people sort of working for them, and they can't engage with anybody. And you think, well, why is that? If we can do it, you know, on our own, why can't everybody else? You know, and social media is the place to do it. That's where you get everybody, you know. Age doesn't come into it, it's just everybody.
Yeah, you've now been challenged online on Facebook as well.
Cara's gone. I mean, do you want a response to that? But I was going to conscious Cara's hands up there.
Well, no, perhaps respond first.
No, I was going to say, working I mean, I've only sort of seriously worked in the last 20 years with 2 organisations, and trying to organisations that are large are bureaucratic in their very nature. And I think there is a definite desire to adopt new technologies. These things just take time. But I'm with you on that. There is definitely a will to be much more responsive and much more engaged and engaging. And I don't know if anyone else who works for a large organisation wants to comment further, but I mean, I go to Past Horizons regularly for news stories as well, so thank you.
I want to start off with saying I really enjoyed the beginning, your beginning presentation, because I'm really strong believer that engagement is integral to the survival of our profession, and it is. And it's time that archaeologists who don't believe that, they need to really realise that it is, because else we will not continue to get the funding that we continue to do. But taking into account that a lot of the past developments of community archaeology, public archaeology, wider public engagement, has really for the last 10, 20 years been underpinned by one funder. How can we move towards an archaeology where wider, high quality engagement is integral to what we do? And how can we kind of support that and underpin that financially? How can it become a core activity of what we do? Sorry.
We don't have to answer that.
No,
Other people may want to answer it, but
it is something that we've that has been discussed at various workshops that I've been at, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all. There isn't a straight answer. There are various options available to the ways in which archaeology is funded, and that requires a certain level of a sea change of attitude across the sector. I mean, one of the things that I can't remember who. There's various people I've been talking to about the ways in which developer-funded archaeology operates, and the fact that if you can educate developers to know what they're asking for, then you have the opportunity to actually have much more participation and outreach around, because that, let's face it, that's a large part of archaeological activities in Scotland. And if we can, I mean, if you go into a shop, and this is the analogy I always use, you go into a shop and you know you need to buy something, but you're not entirely sure what it is you're buying, quite often you'll just go for the cheapest one. Whereas if you actually know what it is you want to get, then you'll walk into that shop and you will buy what best fits your needs. So if we educate developers to the extent that actually they want to give something to the community in which they're doing their development, that's going to involve outreach, that's going to involve public participation. And that is happening in some circumstances, then that's really where we need to get to. So that's, I mean, that's not a straight answer, but there's a myriad of answers.
Can I fling another little layer onto it, because it's a good point, Cara. But I think there's a different way of looking at that, and the different way of looking at it is, why would anybody care whether or not archaeology has got money in the future apart from archaeologists? And that being the case, what is it we need to do to make other people take care of that problem for us?
No,
that's the nub of it.
Yeah.
Because if they don't care, maybe we just have to accept the fact that all we are is a glorified hobby. Now, I don't believe that, and I'm willing to put money where my mouth is to try to move things in a small way in a particular direction. And you see inspirational people like David, who I can remember digging with me 20 plus years ago. Very good artist, actually, so I didn't all this digital stuff. Anyway, the two of you have done that. Nobody gave you any kind of, this wasn't a remit you were given, this didn't come from some major piece of European funding, you just set it up. That's what I mean about, we need to start working out what the hell it is we think is important about what we do, and then we start to show people why it's important, and once we start doing that, I don't think we're going to have to go struggling for money to the same extent that we are now. And the model for it, in a way, is the way that the entire environmental movement has changed in a generation. And I use this, and I apologise for people who've heard me rant about this before, but I did spend briefly a year, more or less, working with Historic Scotland shortly after I left university. And when I was there, I got a sense, this is obviously a different time, it wasn't called Historic Scotland then, the marketers hadn't been in, so it had a great big long unwieldy title. But it was a government department And it was generally, this is on film, isn't it? It was generally considered, I shan't say by anybody in particular, that career civil servants who ended up running Historic Scotland were not necessarily right at the very top of their game, shall we say. But there was one that was considered to be a kind of an even lesser job, and that was the Nature Conservancy Council. Archaeology was a bit more important in the public domain, in the political domain, let's say. It's not the case now, is it? So in a relatively short space of time, that's been transformed. Why has it been transformed? Because people now believe it is in their interests to see that happening. They should see that about archaeology, because archaeology can make a massive difference in people's lives. We're just not very good at telling people that and explaining it and expressing it, in my opinion. And I think we need to get a hell of a lot better at it.
No, I totally agree.
However, we are on that journey, and there are a large number of institutions who are going out to engage with communities. Charity that you're involved in, Alan, obviously the Commission, Historic Scotland provides funds for many of them, Archaeology Scotland. There's a long, long list, and we're all learning, and we're trying to learn from each other. And we're trying through things like the Community Heritage Conference to get communities to learn from each other as well and to inspire each other. So I think there is a culture shift here, and it's taken a while to get to where we are. But I think most of us, and please speak up if you're not, are on the same sort of page, that we need to make archaeology more relevant, that we're learning how to do that, and we're constantly chipping away at the parts of communities that we haven't been able to reach in the past. So something like Scotland's Urban Past, building on the work we did with Scotland's Rural Past, is deliberately going out to engage with hard-to-reach communities and recognising how hard that's going to be, and that we may not always be successful. But whatever we do, we will learn from that, and we'll share that learning, and we'll build up the resources that we need for other people to benefit from them. And I think, thinking about the technology, it's suddenly the knowledge is much more accessible. And one of the key ways that we need to do this, which we did at the end of Scotland's Rural Past, was to put learning material up on the web for anybody in the world to benefit from. And people all over the world are benefiting from that. So I think as I say, we're on the journey, we're learning lessons from each other, we're speaking to each other in general, and I would like to think optimistically that we understand where we want to go. I think just a final reflection is, I think that, obviously I think experts are essential as part of this process, but how about looking at experts as a community of interest in their own right, amongst many other communities, whether they're local communities or other communities of interest, and start to look at ourselves in that light, so that we're obviously very important to ourselves within our own academic or subject area locality, but we're just part of a much wider environment out there. And sometimes we're the most important part of that, and sometimes we're not really very important at all. That's what communities and communities of interest are about. And I think that might, on reflection, be a good way to look at it.
Well said. I think there's more than that. I mean, you correctly brought up the Royal Commission there, Robin, and that's very true. There are lots of organisations doing it. And again, I'll just say something about the sponsors of this event, AOC, who are badged as a commercial organisation. They do a lot of really good stuff, including sponsoring this event. You know, and that's why I don't like these badges. There's lots of people in lots of all archaeological organisations doing that. And I think it is very important that you give that positive slant on it. It's moving. It's slow, but it's moving. My little caveat is I don't think it's done yet. I mean, I encounter people certainly on a weekly basis who are fellow professionals who don't agree with this, who don't think this is the way forward, and in fact who are quite adamant that it's not their responsibility to do anything about public engagement. So there is still a job to be done.
It always reminds me of the slide that Luke uses in some of his lectures of a flotilla all going in the same direction. And I think there's always, in that flotilla, there's always one boat that's facing the wrong way, isn't there? So, you know, but I think we are on that journey. Just to follow up what you said about AOC, I'm also conscious that somebody spoke to the managing director of AOC earlier in the weekend and said, what's AOC doing sponsoring this? What's in it for you? And I think his response, if I'm correct, was because it's the right thing to do. So, you know, he's on the journey, we're all on the journey.
I haven't got the microphone, but there's so many different things one would want to pick up on. But just this point of the organisations, whether government or local government or government bodies, they're looking at the financial outcome. And so often the trouble with archaeology is it comes and it goes. It doesn't leave you in it with something solid. You see this with developer funding work. In the first place, people are saying, oh, bother the archaeologists, they're not letting us build our new road. After it's done, and they've found some lovely, exciting things, the field is put back, and there's nothing on the spot that is left for people to say, this is a marvellous place that we're living in. So that is a problem with archaeology, and I think that that's where the nature conservationists perhaps have an advantage, because they make lovely places for people to go and walk, and natural places. And
Can I stop you right there? They're not natural places. They're natural and cultural places.
Yes.
They are
All
landscapes.
Right. Yep, I'll utterly agree with that. I'm sorry. Now you've put me off my second point.
I'm sorry, but I'm really passionate about that, and it's really important that we don't divide it up.
Yes. No, it's simply that this looking for the financial outcome is self-perpetuating, because archaeology is losing out all the time in funding. This is very obvious from a local government point of view. Dumfries and Galloway is my background. The museums there have lost their archaeologists entirely over the last few years. Funding for local museums is being cut all the time. There's just no feeling that this is going to... The councillors, I'm on the trustee of the Whithorn Trust, and the councillors who come to our trustee meetings constantly say, well, we're only here in order to see the economic benefit. You've got to produce economic benefit every time, which is not always what we want to do. I'd only finish sorry, I go on and on. You were terribly lucky with that Viking Hoard, that you had people who knew what they were doing. I don't think all metal detectorists really know what they're doing. You were also very lucky that Andy Nicholson was on the spot, who knew exactly what he was doing, because, as I say, he's virtually the only archaeologist left on the Dumfries and Galloway Council. There was one more point, and it's disappearing. All right, I'll stop there.
Well, you've provoked a lot of interest.
Yeah.
It's just something about open access. Again, coming from sort of past horizons and how we are able to link to people's reports or not. And GARD, for example, have their online sort of series of reports that people can put up, but you know, most people don't. And then they send us press releases, and then we can put up that press release, and then we can link to these reports, so everybody can actually see it. But across the board, really, apart from that, there's not actually that many open access reports. So you put out a press release and you say, well, you can read the report in whatever journal, but unless you've got, you know, sort of, unless you pay a lot of money, you can't actually access that report. So most of the general public can't access the report. And I know it's, you know, it's not an easy thing to actually get around, but I mean, GARD have been able to do it and do it, and they're a commercial company, but they do it, and it's for the benefit of everybody. Obviously, it's for the benefit of them, but it's obviously the benefit of other people who can't actually, you know, they want to read these things. But we're not actually giving people the, we're not giving them the reports to be able to read. They're not easily accessible. And I think, a national, something national that, can do that would be great.
Are you willing to respond directly to that, Peter?
Can I start by saying that if you want to interest the general public in archaeology, or putting it in a wider term, in material culture, I think you're starting in a good place. Because I, as a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, for some time, have been interested always in how well the professionals relate to the people who are just interested, like I am myself. I started being interested in archaeology when we lived in Caithness, when we looked at stone circles, brocks, and all that sort of thing. And I've always felt that this society treated people who were interested as real people, which is nice. I think I would go further in saying, too, that in my life, as an interested person, and I've seen quite a lot of archaeological places, I feel that there's a lot to be said for letting what you do and the material culture, the material history of places be better known if you let the public know. And also, I have been surprised often about how very little so many people know about treasure trove when I speak to just ordinary people. And I think the recent events in Dumfries and Galloway make it quite clear that that is valuable. So let's talk about it more in the wider world. And I would put it even more, it's not just archaeology, it is the built history of our country, and sometimes even what is not particularly built, but just part of our countryside. So I think I'll stop there. I feel I'm really talking from outside the circle that so many of you are in. And I also feel that when you talk about funding and so forth, you're talking about when you're going to build something new often, be it a road or whatever. Anyway, I said I'll stop, so I'll stop now.
I was going to say, please don't feel outside the circle. This is all about people who are interested in archaeology, and that's what we want to talk about. So come into the body of the Kirk, is one way of putting it. Sorry, Peter, and I wanted to respond.
Yeah, I'd just like to respond to the last point about open access. We actually do have quite a lot of archaeological reports available online. Must be something like over 1,500 through the Archaeology Data Services ARC search facility. That's over the last 7 years. I think what we're not very good about is joining up the information so that the information in the Archaeology Data Service doesn't connect through to the HER records and doesn't link through to Canmore. We need to do much more than just gather data. We need to build knowledge and join the silos together.
Lots of hands going up after that.
It's me again, Rob McCulloch, and I'd just like to respond to Jane Murray's comments about what is happening in Dumfries and Galloway and how I know that for local interested people, it seems like the tide has turned and they are being abandoned, as it were. My own experiences are based very much in the islands, where over the last 20 years, most councils have realised that as part of their responsibility to behave with a shopkeeper mentality, this archaeology becomes part of their stock in trade. The archaeology of the islands is a major economic driver. And so part of the process of seeing it, of giving it, of recognizing its value, comes with that political process, which comes out of sometimes economic hardship. And so to offer Jane some hope, I think Dumfries and Galloway probably need to wake up and go beyond whatever the present economic profile is and see this archaeology stuff as something which they have to engage in and are missing a trick in. You also said that there is a problem with us not, in effect, delivering the goodies, as it were, quick enough. And I'm involved with the A75 Dunraggett bypass. And it feels as if it's mostly my mistake. I'm sure it isn't. But in almost every way that we've tried to drive that project to deliver the very exciting information, 2 Mesolithic houses, 24 burnt mounds, creeks and Bertle beds covered in archaeology right up to the Iron Age. We have managed to fall into every kind of bureaucratic hole you could think of. And so there is always going to be those, what are they called now? Not quite cock-ups, but quagmires. A comment about archaeology reports online, they are fantastic. Historic Scotland pays for quite a lot of them. And so they don't come free, but if you're in the business of putting things online, you have to recognise that publication is an absolutely vital part of the job, and you have to pay for it. But you have to pay for it in a way which gets the maximum number of readers and the maximum interest. So that when we do publish online, we also engage with our communications team who manipulate the press to cover the stories as if they're interested in them. And so that's part of the game as well. So I'm trying to say, in the same way Robin's saying, there are things happening. It's not all bleak. There are lots and lots of initiatives working away. And I think it's important to recognise that. And I think finally we do recognise, I think you said it, that we do actually work in this fantastic landscape, where if you had to choose a place to work, Scotland would come up in the top 10 because of what it's got, and also what it's got in terms of public interest in what we do.
Can I just quickly...
I've remembered what my other point was, thanks to Rod, which was really to say how grateful we are to the AOC, because with their wetland project, they are in fact working in Galloway, and they are working with the schools, with the local people, and trying to spread as much interest as they possibly can. So many thanks to the AOC.
I thought I would just follow up on the open access and follow up also what Rod's just said, and by also highlighting our host, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, having the Scottish Archaeological Internet reports online, and the fact that back issues of the proceedings are online. And am I right in thinking it's the second most downloaded bit of the Archaeology Data Service? And we've actually been funding some open access articles with the Society and the things that we grant aid over the course of the last year. We're still dipping our toe in the water and getting our head around open access, to be perfectly frank. But you can, if we've grant aided one of the articles that's come out in PSAS, that's online for free immediately it's published. So we are all gradually moving in that direction. And I think Jackie earlier was saying that universities, if it's not open access, it's not recognised. So we are moving to that world. These things take time, and nobody's really got their open access policy for books really that sorted out yet, but I think it will come.
Can I, all right now? I was just going to add a few comments, and picking up actually on what the lady here's just said about this does fit into the wider context of the heritage, however defined, and we could spend many, many days, weeks, months discussing what we mean by all of these words, and I think that is important. But I also think we have to remember we're talking about values and what people appreciate and multiple perspectives and all of these things that make the conversation very complex, very challenging, but also very exciting. So I would absolutely highlight the positive nature of what's going on here. And the whole ethos behind Our Place in Time is about understanding this is all about place, landscape, whatever, and it fits into a much wider scenario whereby trying to work out what it is that connects people to their places, and that's not necessarily just physical fabric, but also association. So the whole intangible side, there you go, there's another massive area of discussion. Yeah. But I do think it's worth highlighting that we're also facing challenges in terms of resource and funding. So understanding what it is that, makes people engage with things is an absolutely critical element of all this, and discussions like this and events like this really matter. So we just need to be quite, we do have to hold on to the optimism to see through that. And just to respond directly to Rod's point about language, the strategy is full of buzzwords, but it also has cartoons in it. Much controversy around that for the exact reason of highlighting that it can be stakeholders engaging and leadership and enabling, but it also can just be a bit of fun if you want to have it. And we just need to hold that point as well, I think, because otherwise, you know, it can get a bit grim, really.
Archaeology Scotland, we're in the hundreds. I would like to know how many people here are a member of Archaeology Scotland. And I mean, I'm not using this as a criticism, but one of the problems is that they're able to sell their membership because you have reserves to go to and things. Archaeology doesn't have these. We just have individual sites, scheduled monuments. The National Trust has 300,000 members, but it's not really pushing that archaeology in the historic environment in the same way. That we need to be more active in politics, and that actually means engaging with your local societies and Archaeology Scotland and the Society of Antiquaries. It's only by having the members that we can actually afford to go out and do the politics of going to the councillors and the MSPs and actually making a difference.
Can I just take up that last point with regards to what one might call birdies and beasties? I refer to the natural history rather than other members of the archaeological profession. There are, particularly in terms of land, which is what we're basically talking about, there are some areas where we have the same interests in preservation of areas. And obviously, I'm talking about areas of upland, where the bits that we see as areas of hut circles and field systems and all the other things we get excited in are quite nice places to leave unforested for the benefit of the aforementioned birdies and beasties. The other ones are areas of foreshore, and particularly something that hasn't been mentioned this weekend is these horrible bits of cast of iron that people leave around underwater. They're called shipwrecks. The last time I spoke to somebody from Historic Scotland at some meeting or other and mentioned this, because shipwrecks attract fish and wildlife and things that divers like to look at. And this was just brushed under the carpet. And I think there is a big point here that protecting some of these things on the basis of both their natural history value and their archaeological value, probably in many cases rather more the former than the latter, would have a lot to be said for it.
I feel terrible. It's me again. I'm as bad as you, Rod. There was one point and one question. Again, it's a very interesting point that keeps cropping up. And again, we should always be trying to be positive rather than critical. But take the very good point that Peter was making about the fact that the ADAS does have the reports. There's now, I think they just went past 30-odd thousand pieces of grey literature online. But they're not linked to the HERs yet. Now, I know I could go home just now and I could do it on Badger website. I could link it right now. But so by this evening, they'd be linked. But because we have these sort of monolithic organizations, it's gonna, the glacial speed, it's like walking through treacle just to actually get, you know, a form 8482 to get a hobnob with your coffee on a Tuesday afternoon. We have to actually think about why is that, what are the barriers to that happening? Why can I do it this evening, but it takes so long within a national organization? I know that there's a sort of, but there's barriers there that we have to actually think about now of how to get rid of them. The other one was more of a general one. It was actually one that we did at the CIFA conference with Cara. It was the future of archaeology is, in a way, future archaeologists, the public archaeologists, and how do we train them? Now, anyone that's seen my incredible reenactment of Mons Gropius using a chair and a terrified audience, or, oh oh yes, in fact, there was a bearded serving maid of Bothwell. Anyway, that's another story. But my ability to sort of leap around, throw my arms in the air and create a story, or then to become a therapist to a person who's been troweling, the most therapeutic thing you can do, or being able to then interpret that data and create that report, and then go onto Facebook and maybe Twitter it before then creating a three-dimensional model. These are new archaeologists. Where is the funding to train these new archaeologists going to come from? Because stuff that Northlight's doing, incredibly, a word I can't say. I'll get your help for it. Innovative. Incredibly innovative way of actually reinterpreting archaeological data. But, as people keep saying, it needs funding. So, where can the funding come from to train the new and next generation, the Generation Z of archaeologists?
I've listened to this with enormous interest as somebody who's only recently moved to Scotland, and having been an archaeologist for well over 50 years now. And it seems to me that I'm slightly anxious about the strategy for Scotland and Scotland alone, as though the continuous environment or landscape that Alan's talking about has this line drawn on it, which is either the political line of the current border or the Roman line of the wall. And that we're in danger, as it were, of creating a different past in Scotland to the past that everybody inherits right across, if you like, the whole world. So one of the real problems is the paradox of what is the Scottish past as opposed to everybody else's past. And having also been involved in education for almost as long as that, the question of where we can actually impress upon politicians, and particularly the politicians of education, that knowledge about the past is empowering. The word the past isn't in your screen document, but somehow we're getting to a stage where in the modern world, knowing about the past is, to many people, irrelevant. It's either irrelevant because it's just, history is junk, or it's irrelevant because it's not my past. And in a multicultural society like Scotland, or indeed the whole of the UK at the moment, and I speak as somebody who had to do the focus group for Power of Place for English Heritage, it is incredibly difficult to find a way of making a past work unless you can be all-inclusive. So you can't really easily say that if you're a Pole living in Glasgow, the Picts have any meaning. Somehow we've got to find a way of saying, whatever past it is, it has value, because it's going to tell us something about the human condition. And I don't know how you do that, but it seems to me that we're in danger, particularly if we're now starting to drop history in the Scottish curriculum for secondary schools, that we're in very grave danger of building up a future generation that we're talking about for whom the past has no relevance at all. And my political vision would be that we actually engage with everybody who's involved in knowledge of the past and try to drive forward an idea that that matters. That archaeology is almost the irrelevance here about how you value knowing about the past. It is one way of engagement, but not the only way. So it's not just the flotilla of boats called archaeology. It's also the flotilla which is everybody else involved in trying to deal with the same time dimension. And I'm hoping that the political border is not going to make a Scottish past different from a Great British past, because there is no point at which that continuum stops in terms of our understanding of where we're all engaged. Thank you.
Can I say that's I think, a really useful set of comments. To deal with one of them and take it slightly further, the idea of people coming from diverse backgrounds, having quite a significant number of people who are first, second or third generation immigrants living in Scotland, and the issue of borders. I would say the border is irrelevant in that context. Archaeology is there, and the past, the study of the past more generally, is there as a means of binding those people together because they have shared dimensions to their past, and we have used that in a variety of contexts, and it works, what's more. So you take people and you say, you can do it any way you want. If they lived within the former Roman Empire, you have a point where you can, we did mention the Romans again, you have a shared thing in the past there where you were both occupied by the same imperialist power. But actually, much more interesting than that, you have, in one example we used, people who come from very far-flung places and end up in certain parts of Scotland. And they end up in a particular area within Scotland. You can talk about where they came from and how it compares and contrasts with where they've ended up, where their family histories are from, and how they are the same and how they are different. It comes down to that is a mechanism for bringing people together to share the stories of their lives. And together, they actually start to create a new story, which is one where they're working together, they're existing together. It brings people together. So it is just one of a myriad ways that archaeology can be deeply empowering. I quite agree with you. In a lot of ways, where the Scottish border is or whether there is a border is utterly irrelevant. It isn't in other contexts, but in this context, we don't need to worry about that. And we can still use this subject in a very powerful way.
Alan, I would agree with that, and also just to give a note of reassurance that the flotilla is made up of as many people who wish to be a part of it as they can. It's not just archaeology or indeed history or heritage. It's a very wide-ranging audience reflecting the fact that it doesn't have borders of that way, although, I mean, we use the geographical reality of Scotland simply because that's the political remit we were operating in. However, it's a completely collective agenda, and I would suggest that looking at, for example, what happened last weekend with World Heritage Day, and in fact there was an awful lot of very celebratory, very kind of strong messages that were going around the planet about the value of heritage to everyone in terms of what it tells us about ourselves today and the way it can create shared narratives and shared meaning, and the fact that Scotland has 5 and we hope 6 World Heritage Sites in its collection, as it were, is something we should all be proud of. And going back to Jonathan's point earlier on, one of them is St Kilda, managed and owned by the National Trust of Scotland, and a natural and cultural site, of which I think there are only about 30 on the planet. So, you know, we have these amazing things here, but it is about what they can do for all of us and those shared narratives. And for example, that this is not the first time that there have been large numbers of Polish people living in Scotland, or the connections historically between Scotland and Poland go back hundreds of years. So building on those connections, you actually link the people now with people then that makes them feel more, you know, part of this narrative, not that they're just some alienated bit of it. So I think, again, it's a very good point, but it's one where you have to be able to, as a collective, be able to really challenge that notion that it is narrowly defined or kind of parochial, because it is the ultimate non-parochial thing, actually. Anyway, sorry, I'll shut up now.
I'm slightly conscious of time in that we're now past 4:15, which is the discussion of archaeology's progress and demands, but I think we're all doing that anyway. So are you comfortable that we keep going until Richard takes over? Okay.
I just was thinking something that hasn't really been touched on. It might have been a bit about is collaboration, not just within the heritage sector, but within Dig It, for example, working with Minecraft. If any of you got a chance to talk to Stephen earlier this weekend, we've worked with Brewdog and other brewers along those lines. We're working with a composer. If you check out our website, there's things like storytelling up there, Glenlivet Open Days, things like that. So, okay, we need people to realize that archaeology is important, but maybe it's not just us who needs to do it. Maybe you need to approach people and say, okay, you're interested in whiskey, or you're interested in literature, or in fact the Polish festival that happens each year. Maybe we need to get through to them and realize that these interests are all linked up and work through it that way. I don't know if anyone else has any opinions on that.
I think lots of nodding of heads. Yeah. Cara.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree that partnerships will be key to widen engagements, you know, who are we telling these stories to, and who are we creating these stories with. And I don't want to, you know, well, I am going to. I'm going to mention a project that we did with Adopt a Monument, Archaeology Scotland's Adopt a Monument scheme called Women at War. And we worked with Rothschild's Women's Aid to record a World War II airbase in Tarbert Peninsula up in the Highlands. And what we did there was we used, and just exactly what Alan was saying. We used archaeology as a mechanism to create a group that met up once a week to research the history of that airbase, to record the history of the airbase and record the remains of that airbase. So in that case, as I say, we just used archaeology as a mechanism, and it's because we put the people at the centre of the project rather than the archaeology. And I think it was a great learning curve for us of what you can and can't do, and it was a great learning curve as well. Hopefully it will be a good example for other people in Scotland of how archaeology can be used in that positive way. And I think, for me, one key example was one woman who was involved with the project had been relocated to that area by Women's Aid. She'd lived in another part of Scotland. And Women at War helped her discover her new local area. It helped her gain a new appreciation of her local area. And that, as I say, that was just an archaeology project. So.
Don't say just. That was an archaeology project. I think the general tone is quite positive. I think I feel very enthused and invigorated by a lot of this discussion. I hope most of you do as well. We have, I think, looked at some of the challenges, and we've actually looked at a lot of the positives. We've used words like journey, flotilla, but we are all heading in the same direction. Does anyone want to make any final points before we start to wrap this up? Because I haven't seen any hands go up so frequently now. In which case, I'll hand over to you.
Can we, just before we do that,
Oh, yes.
as a payoff, there is still this. Scotland's archaeology strategy, out for consultation. I can understand if people feel jaundiced about it and are fed up with these things. Oh, not another thing where I have to give my opinions. I'm so sorry. Oh. But this is 10 years.
Mm-hmm. It's a draft.
It's a draft. It's deliberately meant to be asking you to come. Even if you come at it from the point of view of if there's one thing, just one thing that really gets to that you want to see happening, that you want the subject to tackle, the discipline, the profession, the area, whatever, please write in with it so that it can be taken into account and try to come up with your idea for how that might happen, because we want it to have everybody's opinions in it as best we can. It'll never be perfect, ever. You know that as well as we do, but let's have a go at it.
Can I just add to that, we don't just want professional archaeologists to respond.
Indeed.
We want anybody and everybody to respond, because the whole point of this is about getting everybody involved. So please don't feel that for some reason you shouldn't respond. If you feel, I would hope that there's something in there that you either agree with, you disagree with, but something that actually makes you think, I do want to respond to this. And please do, because we do want to hear your views.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure you'll agree that both Alan and Becky certainly did their job in provoking ideas and discussion, and you all performed marvellously as well. A lot of great ideas coming up there. Many things mentioned, not in any particular order: TT, treasure trove, equality issues, shipwrecks, all sorts of different things. In many ways, what was quite instructive was the things that you didn't choose to raise or talk about. A discussion like this could well have focused on things like the lack of money, the lack of opportunity, the lack of people to carry out the work, the lack of skills, all sorts of issues like that. But we didn't go there. Where you went, it seemed to me, loudly and clearly, where most of the discussion was about engagement, getting the messages out there. We seem to have a wonderful confidence that actually what we're doing is worthwhile. We're doing it well within the sort of resources and opportunities we have, and we've got a really interesting, important message to get out there. And what we're actually doing is a bit of soul searching about how can we do that even better. And I think that's a good place to be in many ways. Let me say, as president of the Society, I will do my best to interest council and other people on the Society and how to take that thought forward. But without wishing to sound patronising or glib about it, insofar as that is a big thing that we're thinking about, it is at least one where we can all as individuals improve our act. We can do our own thing. We've seen examples, the ones that Jackie talked about, the ones that David raised this afternoon. These are things that we can all do. We can engage more with the new technology. And if we're so passionate and so interested in doing it, even I'm going to have to look at some of this as well. Remind me I said that. Please do. Okay. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you once again to Rebecca and Alan for doing such a splendid job for us. So, thank you.